If you go to Vermont, you will, and go to Stowe, Vermont, you will see like a Luce hill, a Luce cemetery, and all of that there. My ancestors settled the town of Stowe. Didn't know enough to hang on to those hills, but that's where they settled. In the Vermont history books, they have a photo of my, I don't know how many greats back, grandfather Oliver Luce, pulling his wife to Vermont on a hand sled, which I just don't believe is really true, but they do have that engraving in the Vermont history books. So they were among the first settlers in Vermont. You know, so my dad did a lot of logging in the woods, and then went to work for the neighbor logging, and my mother continued at the post office. My dad passed away when I was in college, and you know, and my mother, of course, was very lucky that she had a job, and so that's how they lived. I had a horse that was, his name was Blind Staggers, and somehow us kids, my brothers, sisters, had convinced my dad that this blind horse would be a great asset on the farm. And so I remember, you know, raking the hay with Blind Staggers, and going down to the village. And he was very smart. He could wherever I went, he would be able to find his way back. But poor Blind Staggers, you know, he couldn't eat hay, so I would always try to sneak special treats to him, you know, in ground up grain, or you know, any like lettuce leaves that were left over in the winter, you know, that kind of thing. So he was a great old horse. So we did all of the work on the farm with horses, and as I mentioned, I had a goat that used to follow me around. Also, we somehow had convinced our dad that it would be a good thing to have a goat on the farm. So those, you know, and of course, getting up early and milking the cows, and hating to get up because, especially in the winter, we had wood stove, and so the stove usually would go out by morning, and my dad, the first thing I would hear is my dad starting up the stove, and how cold it was. I started out in school very slowly. I flunked or failed the first grade, and then I remember one time the teacher came in to see my mother about my slow progress, and there was in the door. They were in the back room, but there was a crack in the door. So I listened to my grade school teacher tell my mother not to expect much of me, and then after she left, I was sort of moaning and groaning about how she said that I wasn't going to accomplish much, and so my mother said, "Well, you know, that's what you get for listening through the crack in the door." So I have tried not to listen into the crack in the door anymore. But it was good, you know, to know, you know, that I was going to have to work a little bit harder. So I studied real hard, and did well in school. You know, I would always go to the library. I forget whether it was Wednesday night or whatever night it was, one night a week. One of our neighbors was the librarian, and I've always loved books. You know, and as I said, I would take my poetry books when I went after the cows, and I just read a lot. My dad was a very strong Republican. My mother was a very strong Democrat, and I remember in the election of Truman and Dewey, that election, my mother put Truman's picture up over her side of the bed, and my dad put Dewey up over his side of the bed, and so that's how they dealt with things. My dad felt I should be like a mechanic or something like that, do something real manly. My mother felt I should go to college. So it was conflicting interests on the part of my parents. I I ended up, I was very lucky. I had scholarships, so I could go to college on my own, and I did. I always wanted to go to college. I was very curious, you know, intellectually. I did a lot of reading as a kid, and I wanted to go to travel. This woman, a neighbor, was always talking about Africa, you know, and Dr. Livingstone, and you know, and all of that. And so I wanted to go. I was not religious enough really to go as a missionary. So, but I always thought that would be interesting to go and live in the depth of Africa. I went to University of Vermont, which was both convenient because it's in Vermont where I lived, and because for me it was free. I was able to get scholarships, you know, as a result of being, you know, from a very poor family and getting them, you know, academically. I also worked. I was worked in the cafeteria, where we got all our food for free, and then from my sophomore year on, I was at like a dorm counselor, you know, which I think was a very good thing for me to do because, you know, you're in charge of making sure that well, on a floor, I think it was like 80 freshmen, and then later I was in charge of one of the big dorm buildings, you know, and so and I probably, my first kind of radical things were, we had a lot of, we had a lot of Korean veterans, you know, veterans of the Korean War. And so they got caught with beer in their room at one time. And so that went to the council, which was all the counselors in the dorms. You know, there was 3 big buildings, so there were 12 of us, and I sort of led the group to say, well, you know, these are Korean veterans. You know, they're in their 20s or early 30s, and you know, and if we kick them out, you know, that destroys their life. So we should keep them. And I remember I had this big argument with the dean of students, who was leading the charge to kick them out of school. So that was the first time I ever did anything kind of on the radical side, and we won. So that was an important thing, you know, because, you know, they were veterans, they were older, they had 1 can of beer, so why kick them out of school and destroy their lives? And then I went on to Cornell. I got my master's there in farm management and agricultural development, basically economic development. And sort of on my last day, took my exams and went off to Vietnam. Why Vietnam, first of all? It was because that was one of 2 choices I had. I had looked around for a job overseas because that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to see another country, and I wanted to work with really poor people there. And a man came to speak at Cornell from the Rockefeller Foundation, and so after class, I asked him. I was like an intern for that particular class, so I asked him, you know, how can I get a job overseas? And he gave me the name of IVS, International Voluntary Services, and the American Friends Service Committee, the Quakers. So I sent off letters to both of them, and IVS offered me a choice of either Laos as a mechanic, which I'm not, and Vietnam as a horticulturalist. And I went off to Vietnam basically to work on growing sweet potatoes. When I went to Vietnam in 1958, I was, I guess, typical of young Americans. I saw the U.S. as bringing good things to the world, you know, of helping out in terms of agriculture, medicine, that sort of thing. I had studied agriculture in college, and so I thought that I would go to Vietnam to work in my case, on sweet potatoes, and I would be helping people that were very poor. And my heroes at that time were President Eisenhower. I even liked Joseph McCarthy, you know, in those days, because he was out to get the communists. And it wasn't until he attacked Dwight D. Eisenhower that I began to understand, in a certain way, that was just off the wall, you know, sort of thing. It was something he shouldn't be doing. So I was very concerned about, you know, all of the people that were being charged with un-American activities, because I felt that one of the good things about America was that we could challenge things that were not right and support things that we agreed with and thought were right. When I went to Vietnam in 1958, I worked with North Vietnamese refugees who had come down in 1954. They were very anti-communist, and they supported my beliefs, you know, and it wasn't until some of them began to raise questions. The first questions, I think, were about corruption of officials, people that wouldn't pay, you know, them their monthly wage. And later, when I was in Saigon, things became more dramatic in a way. I mean, I was teaching agriculture at the university, and my students would disappear for a few weeks, a few months, and come back and show me the marks of torture, you know, like cigarette burns, you know, cigarettes that have been extinguished, you know, on their shoulders, or you know, that kind of thing. They told me about water torture and that the experience of the water dripping down on them, or being forced, you know, pumped into them. And I think that was the final straw for me. I became and am a pacifist. I didn't see war as solving any problems. I saw it doing tremendous harm, you know, not only in terms of torture, which was going on, but also in terms of, as an agriculturalist, I would see farmers lose their land, either because of defoliation or because they simply were moved out of their village, you know, where they could be protected. I saw the cultural things breaking down, you know, as young women, for example, were forced into prostitution. So my odyssey was one of being very anti-communist, feeling in a way that we could do no wrong, that we were going abroad to other countries to help them, to increase the yields of crops of farmers, and to promote an idea of freedom. It took me maybe almost, let's say, 7-8 years in Vietnam to reach the point that I would challenge those things. I still felt and feel today that one of the great things about American philosophy is that people should challenge injustices and should have the right to speak out. But in the Vietnam War, I felt very, very strongly that those things that I believed in, that freedom of speech and that sort of thing, was being denied, and that we were not going to Vietnam to improve the standard of living or to help people. We were going there to control. Every argument that the U.S. government put forth as to why we should be there, when you were there, you saw the arguments were wrong. You know, there was no... I mean, the Vietnamese had always been the country that prevented the southward movement of China. There weren't the vast resources that we could exploit, you know, later in Vietnam. Vietnam's great resource is the strength of its people. And that was a resource that, in terms of our relationship with Vietnam, we needed a friendly relationship that would benefit both the Vietnamese and the U.S. So it was an unwinnable war. People were being tortured. Farmers were losing their livelihood. Young women were being forced into prostitution. The cities were getting overcrowded, and the beneficiaries of the war were a very few and quite wealthy people, and they obtained their wealth because they could speak English and would work with the U.S. forces. And it was an exploitative relationship on everybody's part, on their part, on our government's part. And I feel now, many years later, so sorry for those people who had thought that America was going to be there forever and they were going to be rich forever. And in the end, so many of them were forced out of the country, because they could no longer make those incredible profits. They took little boats, and the little boats were captured by pirates, and the women were raped. Whatever resources they were taking out of Vietnam were taken away by the pirates. And it was a terrible and hard time for them. At the same time, within Vietnam, you had thousands of acres of land that had been defoliated. You had people that normally would have been going to school that were shining shoes, all sorts of service occupations for the soldiers. And those were occupations that were no longer useful, when the war was over. So, so I became a pacifist because of what I saw in Vietnam. Grace Paley, one of the people probably many of you know, and she's a well-known short story writer. If you took English 101, you probably read her books and that sort of thing. Anyway, she wrote a story about one political prisoner, and I just want to read a little part of what she wrote. She wrote it about Tao Tau, who was a political prisoner, and Grace wrote, "In prison, Tao Tau was beaten on the head with truncheons. Her head was locked between two steel bars. Water was forced down her throat. She was suspended above the ground. Then, on November 20, 1968, she was transferred to the National Police Headquarters. The Vietnamese Catholic priest, Father Chun Tin, in a plea for international concern about her case, wrote that she was further beaten and subject to electric shock. She's become insane, Father Chun Tin wrote, unable to sleep for 15 days, believing herself to be a pampered dog that could only eat bread and milk. Not being given these, she refused to eat and became so weak she couldn't talk. When the wind blew, she wanted to fly. Late in 1969, Tao was transferred to the tiger cages of Con Son. She was there for a year and transferred to Bien Hoa Insane Asylum. For several days, she was hung from an iron hook. Her spine was damaged by this torture, and she still wears a neck brace. You saved our lives, Tao later wrote. I still remember the strange foreign voices when you came. In the cages, we wondered what new indignities were to be visited upon us. But a foreigner, and that was me, but a foreigner who spoke Vietnamese with a heavy accent told us it was a congressional investigation from the U.S. We had prayed for such an inquiry and took the chance to speak of the tortures. We begged for water and food. We were dying, you know. Tao was 16 years old, a 16-year-old student then. She was put in cages because she would not salute the flag. She was obstinate, the prison director said at the time. The oldest prisoner in the cages was Ba Sao. She was blinded by the caustic lime that was thrown down onto the prisoners as a disciplinary measure. I was a communist, she says, but the others were only student protesters, Buddhists and writers. Today, behind the 5-foot by 9-foot cages is a cemetery for 20,000 people who died in Kan San prison. Most graves are unmarked. The prisoners at Kan San didn't even have numbers. When the survivors return, they bring flowers, pray, and softly sing the songs that were whispered in the cages some 35 years ago.